is that at the ceremony, it's the right of the Bishop of Durham to accompany the monarch. And as we said, Victoria only went to the Abbey the day before, and she's certainly not very complimentary about him, because he's at her side during the ceremony, and during the journal entry, she describes to Lord Melbourne that he's remarkably maladroit, because he could never tell her what was due to take place when it should have been.
Welcome to Coronation Catastrophes, a Royal History Geeks podcast commemorating the coronation of King Charles III and Queen Camilla.
It's summer 1838, and Britain is experiencing a new dawn. Following the years of George III's incapacitation and the debauchery of his sons, a new young queen had come to the throne the previous year, and she's about to be crowned. Born in 1819 during the succession crisis following the death of the Prince Regent's only daughter Charlotte in childbirth, Alexandrina Victoria was a small girl with a big temperament and all of the violent passion of her Hanoverian forebears. She certainly didn't hold back in expressing her sentiments, and we can see this in her own writings, preserved for posterity in her journals, which she kept faithfully each day. When asked in an interview in the 1970s if her grandmother ever used the words "we are not amused," the late Princess Alice, Countess of Athlone, replied, "Wasn't it a pity?" Now, while that phrase may have been nothing more than a figment of the imagination, garnered during the long years of widowhood, there was certainly little that would have amused the 19-year-old Queen at her coronation. While other coronation ceremonies may have been beset by problems ahead of the event, but were all right on the night, Victoria's didn't live up to that adage. There was much confusion about the form of service. She was made to wait around an indeterminable amount of time. An elderly peer was almost injured paying homage, and the Queen left the Abbey with a very painful finger. In this episode, we look at the events in this tumultuous ceremony, and using the Queen's own words, we explore some of the familial relations within the royal family itself at the time.
Hello and welcome to the fourth in our series of Coronation Catastrophes, a Royal History Geeks podcast commemorating the coronation of King Charles III and Queen Camilla. I'm Royal History Geeks creator Gareth Streeter, and I'm joined, as usual, as I have been for the duration of the series, by royal commentator James Taylor. James, how are we?
I'm all right, thank you. I'm excited that the coronation, King Charles's coronation, is almost upon us. I'm sad that this is going to be the last in our series of coronation catastrophes.
I know. I'm sad. I'm sad as well. I mean, we could obviously. There's been a lot of coronations over the years, and we just, in the interest of time, decided to focus on these four moments and to do the catastrophes theme. But it's been such good fun, and I hope people have enjoyed listening to them in the run up to the coronation. And I hope people feel that even, when they come across this years later, they still feel it's relevant. And people, whenever they're listening to them, they'll find like an episode like today's episode of Queen Victoria timeless.
Sure. But I must say, I am feeling the pressure a bit, because after all, we're always being told, fail to prepare to fail. Now, that could really be true of Victoria's coronation.
Yes, I suppose we should bring ourselves back to the topic of today, Queen Victoria's coronation. Yeah, because we've called this whole series a coronation catastrophes, which, as we've always said, is a light-hearted look, an excuse to talk about the politics and the surroundings of coronations in years gone by. We're not in any way suggesting that coronations are catastrophic in their own right, or indeed that this one will be. But I think people will say, and I should say as well, we've recorded all of these podcasts before putting any of them out, so we don't know any of the reaction to any of the previous ones. will be. I think some people would say, okay, guys, I really enjoyed these, but cheeky. They're not really catastrophes, are they? The coronations are perfectly fine. You're just talking about some of the surrounding noise and politics around them. But actually, Victoria's really arguably could be the one that gets called a coronation of catastrophes. But what I'm wondering is how much of that has come down to us in either popular culture or even through popular fiction. Is it really true? Was it as bad as all that?
I think we can say it was as bad as all that, really. I mean, Victoria's coronation, when you look at it, and certainly when you look at the accounts of it, it is just one incident after another. And one can't help but speculate that some more preparation might have helped matters. I mean, the Queen didn't visit Westminster Abbey until the day before the coronation. And even then, she wasn't keen to do it. She only does it because Lord Melbourne suggests that this would be a good idea for her to go and see the Abbey for herself and see the space where she's going to be crowned. And she emerges from the Abbey after the rehearsal. Well, a rehearsal seems a bit too formal a term for what actually happened. But she writes in her journal for the day before the coronation, "I'm very glad I went to the Abbey. Now I know exactly where to go and where to be, etc." And, well, she didn't on the day, to be fair.
So would you put much of the blame at her door then, her own personal lack of preparation?
No, I think that's probably a bit unfair. I think that you certainly can put a lot of the blame at her door because I mean, you have to remember that Queen Victoria's 19 at this time. You know, she's only just turned 19. She's been queen for a year, and after all of those years of seclusion in Kensington Palace, of only being able to go downstairs holding either a mother's hand or Baroness Late's and her governess's hand, of not being able to see anyone in private, not being able to go, and that's why on the day she becomes queen, you see, she meets Lord Melbourne alone, as I always intend to do with my ministers. I received this person alone. I went into the council alone. All of those things. So there's obviously been a huge shift in her life, not just becoming queen and taking on the responsibilities, but in personal terms, that she's acting on her own agency rather than on her mother's or anyone else's. So I think that has probably both her youth and the sense that she is now queen does breed that sort of false sense of pride, and that sort of, and we all know pride goes before a fall. So yes, I do think that it's
someone else's fall in this case, but
yes, someone else's fall. Although in fairness, we can't really blame her for that bit. But you are right. Somebody else does fall, and Victoria does have a sort of false sense of pride. But I think as well, we'll explore throughout this, there is more to it than that. I mean, they couldn't decide on that. I mean, Victoria's coronation is a year after she comes to the throne, unlike some of the others that we've looked at, where Henry VIII's coronation was 2 months after he came to the throne. Same with Henry VII. Queen Victoria, there's a full year, but yet it's only very late on they actually decide when the date is going to be. There's lots of discussions to and fro in the cabinet of when the date is actually going to be. And she describes as well the Bishop of Durham after the service as being rather maladroit because he didn't seem to know where things were, what was happening either. So no, we can't say it's entirely Victoria, but I think it is fair to say that a lot of it is engendered through her sort of false sense of pride, false sense of security, that everything will be all right on the night. And she's put in very little effort herself. And it seems also that a lot of the officials have put in not no effort, but they all seem to have a little bit of a lax attitude of it will be all right. And I think as well there's that false sense of security because it's only 7 years after William IV has been crowned, 17 years since George IV has been crowned as well. So they've had 2 coronations in recent memory. So I think that again engenders that sort of thing. Oh, it's happened quite recently, so therefore it will be, people will know what to do and it'll all be fine. Well, it's kind of not really.
Well, I've got 2 questions for you leading on from all that. I'll ask them separately and give you a chance to answer each. So the first one, do you think, so Queen Victoria's coming to her coronation completely unprepared, doesn't know what she's doing, but with a false sense of confidence, which really is probably born out of girlish naivety, that confidence, rather than an ingrained hubris, perhaps. Do you think that is symbolic of the way she came to the throne, completely unprepared, but probably with a girlish naivety? I mean, I remember there's a, I mean, you can probably tell me whether this is true or not, because I can't remember where I've read it, but where she's looking with Lord Melbourne at the list of peers attending, and she says to him, "Oh, well, there aren't many viscounts coming, are there?" And he says, "Well, no,
Yeah.
there aren't many viscounts." Now, given how important society was in these days, and to be a participating member of the nobility as an adult, you knew your viscounts from your marquesses and your countesses from your baronesses, and who was who. That mattered, and she had that kind of level of naivety over how the whole system of aristocracy and politics that she was now at the head of worked. Is there a dramatic symbolism in this catastrophe of a coronation?
Well, I think that, well, firstly, on the issue of the viscounts, wasn't the reason given that to be a viscount wasn't quite an English title?
Not English. Oh, you see that? You go right back to medieval. You basically, I mean, all right, let's do a little history of the peerage, even though this is a tangent. Yeah, basically, you have in the oldest post-Norman feudal nobility that we have, you have barons as a very generic term for all the landed class. Quite soon, straight away, really, you have the revival of an old Anglo-Saxon term, earl, to mean a kind of baron of the barons, a few premium, maybe 5 or 6 barons that stand a little taller than everywhere else. By the time you're kind of getting to 14th, 15th century, you've kind of got earl and baron as 2 recognized classes of the peerage, and by that stage duke has been added as the sort of super earl. That's added really by in the century before, in the 13th century. And so really you've got baron, earl and duke are seen as the main proper English titles, and then marquess is sort of seen as this slightly French, which is no bad thing, because I mean a lot of continental noble practices are French, but sort of excessive thing that's kind of brought in under Richard II, this king of excess, and it's seen as almost a bit vain, but for an earl not quite good enough to be a duke. And then viscount, I can't tell you exactly when viscount comes in, but they start becoming popular in the reign of Henry VI, where Henry VI was a nice man but a very inactive king, and he basically just gave everyone whatever they asked for. So a lot of barons would cheekily be like, "Oh, hey, Henry VI, I'm a baron. Fancy make me a viscount?" And you just get this sort of grade inflation from a load of barons to viscounts, and there's a bit of a sense of that's a bit cheap. If you can't be an earl, just be proud of being a baron. Don't do the whole viscount thing. Anyway, that's a complete tangent. But yes, no, you're absolutely right. It isn't particularly English, but Victoria should have known that.
And it's also very ironic, given that Melbourne himself was a viscount.
Yes, and I think that's partly why she was, at this stage, we'll talk about this later, she sort of got this either fatherly or other infatuation with Melbourne, and I think she probably therefore is revering viscountcies more than she might realize. But again, she's just become head of a system, and she knows nothing about that.
No, but I mean, I think the thing to remember there is that as a child, I mean, she did only come to the throne at 18, so she'd not had much opportunity before then. But although she had gone on progress and she had visited places, where they'd been hosted by members of the nobility, essentially, because of the type of upbringing that she'd had, the Kensington system, where she was sort of locked away in Kensington Palace, she had very little to do with any of the Georgian uncles. Very rarely was able to go to court. And when she did, of course, that very famously, not long before she came to the throne, there was the great falling out with William IV and her mother, the Duchess of Kent. So there was certainly no love lost between her and members of the old royal family, as they referred to themselves later. So I think that she'd had, even as a child, she'd very little experience of life outside the walls of Kensington Palace and outside of meeting the aristocracy. And so therefore I think that led to that sense of naivety, really, or certainly didn't help it. And of course the fact that her mother was German, her father had died, so there was very little interaction, really. So I think that didn't help.
Her mother is a more sort of fastidious German background, believed that the English nobility were basically a load of drunken old oversexed loafs that she thought was a corrupting influence.
Yes. And is that, one could argue that's probably not too far from the truth at this point. Well, certainly, I mean, that may be a bit unfair on the wider aristocracy, but certainly on George III's sons, that's not an unfair summary, given the number of the levels of drunkenness, of sort of debauchery and drunkenness, and number of illegitimate children, all of that. In the Georgian period, that's we see it as one sort of long debauched tale. Now we may be looking at that slightly unfairly, but even so, it's I think not far from the truth, and so therefore that assessment is probably harsh, but there's probably truth in it.
Yeah. No, I think you're right, and I think it's actually because one of the problems, I don't know if this is a problem, but it's a reality, is Queen Victoria's story is at its most beautiful as she's getting to marry her cousin husband Albert. And that's the bit that I think many of us who are interested in this era really focus in on. Obviously it's through fiction, but also journal entries, letters around that period. And at that period, so this young Victoria that we look at her mother as quite a hostile figure, because Victoria at this age is seeing the damage that isolation has done to her, and she's not grateful for it. Wind the clock on 10 years, and you see how Victoria and Albert are collectively able to restore the dignity of the monarchy through being this quite proper, moralistic Christian family. You can start to give more credit to Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, thinking you were probably part of that. And actually Victoria, whether she ever acknowledged it or not, and I think she did more in later years, had something to be praised about, even if she didn't handle everything in the best possible way.
No, and I know that again, this is something we'll talk about in more depth a bit later on, but certainly by the time, certainly by the 1850s, the Duchess of Kent, she's got older, she's revered not just by Victoria, but by the family, but also when the Duchess of Kent dies, which is of course in the same year that Albert dies. So her death and the effect that it had on Victoria is often overlooked, I think, because of Albert's death. But she has a complete nervous collapse after her mother's death, and her journals are full of entries of my poor dear good mamma. And I never showed her how much I loved her, and that type of entry where at this point they're probably as far apart as they ever were.
And that's where we meet. This is where we meet Victoria. I guess that's the point I'm trying to add. Of course, it depends when you start studying her, but for most of us, this is roughly when we meet Victoria, and therefore the Duchess of Kent is still a bit of a demon rather than a tragic heroine who's genuinely tried her best through quite difficult circumstances. I think so. My second question for you, and I guess probably at some point we should probably actually describe to people exactly what did go wrong at Victoria's coronation and what the particular things were. But in one sense, I wonder, because of the access to source material that we have, whether we're harsher on this coronation because there's things we know. So we go back to a Tudor coronation, and we don't have a detailed account of Henry VII or Henry VIII's coronation as we describe, but certainly the court heralds, certainly Henry VII liked to write about things, would not have recorded these kinds of things going wrong, partly because it would not have been politic to do so, and partly because that wasn't really the bit they're interested in. They were just trying to preserve the order of precedence and things like that so future generations could copy it. So had something like this, some of these things gone wrong, they probably wouldn't have got mentioned. I mean, as everyone knows, just because I haven't yet plugged my book on Prince Arthur in this edition, you can read between the lines and see how much was going wrong at Arthur's christening, and it's quite comical in the way the sort of the heralds skirt around it, but it's not explicitly said. And I'm always conscious that although we might say, oh yeah, well, if something had happened in a late medieval or Tudor coronation, the official account wouldn't have have captured it, but there'd be a bitchy letter from an ambassador, or there'd be a bitchy monk chronicling about it somewhere, so it would survive. I'm not so sure, because in Arthur's coronation, he never had a coronation.
Poor
which
Arthur
is a
never got to that
catastrophe.
stage, did he?
No, and that is a catastrophe. But with Arthur's christening, you can tell it's all going wrong because the herald can't really get around it, although it's sort of played down. But there's no other account of that. I mean, there is one other account, but again, it's even shorter. Doesn't have any of the juicy stuff in there. There's no sort of bitchy diplomatic account of it. Admittedly, it's slightly too early for that kind of thing. In the reign of Henry VIII, there would be more access to that. So what I'm saying, this is my long-winded way of saying, we know a lot about what went wrong with Victoria's because of Victoria's own diary. Had we had a diary from other people, we might have found more that gone wrong, and we wouldn't maybe. So Victoria's a victim of her own committing of the facts to history.
She is. The other thing I would say is that, of course, we do have mass media by this stage. I mean, not to the stage we have today, but we do have newspapers, and so there would have been accounts that were published as well as Victoria's own accounts. So I think that it would have been more difficult to keep any real catastrophic events private. And of course, you have to remember that we don't have the same level of catastrophic events in Edward VII's coronation. I mean, I know Edward VII's coronation is postponed because of his illness, but on the day it goes well. George V's coronation. George VI's coronation, I know that the Archbishop possibly did put the crown on the wrong way around. They couldn't decide whether it was right, but there still wasn't the same number of things that beset Victoria, and they were obviously more immediately public. Yes. So yes, you're right, but I think that it's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy almost, because all of those things did go wrong for Victoria. But yes, we do know about them because she did write them in the journals. And of course, but then I suppose the bigger question is, how much can we trust the journals given their editing?
Right. So, and just, I mean, this is probably something worth mentioning. Now, a lot of people will be aware of this. So Queen Victoria was a prolific diarist. I mean, she was the Samuel Pepys of Victorian England. She wrote, I think, every day or nearly every day, a fairly detailed account of her day. And upon her death, there were just volumes and volumes and volumes. She knew that they would one day become public. So she asked her youngest daughter, Princess Beatrice, who had been her lifelong secretary stroke companion. How willing Beatrice was for that role is perhaps harder to know, but she didn't really have a choice. And she says, basically, Beatrice, when I die, your role as my secretary is not over. You are to edit all my diaries and to ensure that certain things are removed, things that might cause embarrassment, etc., which and you will have followed this debate with much interest, James, but a lot of people believe Victoria, not necessarily Victoria commissioned, but Beatrice would have taken it upon herself to remove dark secrets from Victoria's. Was there a secret wedding that has been lost to John Brown? Was there the pregnancy of Princess Louise that's chopped out of these diaries? Is there a dark secret that, I mean, what do you think about all of that?
I think that because of the nature of it, we'll never know about some of the things that would have been excised. What I would say, though, is that we do actually have more access to the original sources than you might think, because although Princess Beatrice did take a very risk-averse approach, and you're right, particularly where members of the royal family are mentioned, they are, a lot of information is excised. And of course, Victoria did write her journal every day, but even when there were things of nothing of note happened. And so Beatrice did miss some of those out when there was nothing, and that wasn't for any reason of upsetting anyone. It was just because they were too dull or too tedious to be preserved for history. Got up at 8 o'clock and went for a walk around the lake or something like that. Something like that would have just been removed altogether because it wasn't considered. I mean, Victoria did actually write in her journal that she felt that they would be saved for posterity. So that is something that she was keen on herself. This is writing in the 1840s, before Beatrice is born, and even when I'm sure she only has 2 or 3 children at this point. So she was thinking about the future and her place in history as she was writing them. But we do actually have more access to the original sources than you might imagine, because some of the early diary entries, journal entries, were actually transcribed for Lord Esher.
Right.
And so some of those do survive. So when you look at them, and when we'll look at the coronation entry in more detail, there are certain pieces of information which are included in Lord Esher's transcripts that are in the ones that were copied out, because of course Beatrice copied them all out by hand as well. And so if you look at the originals, because they've all been digitized and now available online by the Royal Archives, you can see Beatrice's sort of spider handwriting. And although, yes, you do get the digital copies, you can see that sometimes the words it's difficult to make out the words exactly, whereas the transcripts that were made for Lord Esher were actually typewritten. So that does mean that there's a bit less uncertainty about what was being said. And of course, we also have to remember that there were 2 volumes of the journals that were published during Victoria's lifetime. So there was Leaves from our Journal of our Life in the Highlands, which covered 1848 to 1861, and then the sequel, More Leaves, from the Journal of Our Life in the Highlands, from 1862 to 1882. Now, I know that they're only abridged versions, they only refer to her stays at Balmoral, but even so, they were published during her lifetime. So there is more access to the sources from immediately from what and admittedly it was only what Victoria wanted to be published. So there's probably an element of self-censorship there, but it must be said that we do have more access than only Beatrice that had copied out, and that becomes evident when we look at some of the entries around the coronation, and certainly around some of the people that are mentioned.
Wouldn't it be amazing if we found somehow the Princess Beatrice had left the original? She hadn't really burned the originals, but she'd left the originals in like a time capsule or something that somehow could only be discovered 100 years after her death, or something. I mean, I know that is not going to happen, but it would be phenomenal, wouldn't it?
Well, if it were, we'd only have about 20 years to go, because Beatrice died in 1944. So.
Exactly. So. But no, I know that wouldn't happen. So did Beatrice know that Lord Esher had a copy? Do you think it was transcribed some of these?
We don't know for sure, but we don't believe so. We don't believe so because obviously Beatrice had been created her mother's literary executor, and so. But those copies have been made during the last years of Victoria's life. So we think that she didn't know, because if she did know, she would probably have wanted to have sight of them and have them destroyed. But we don't know that for sure. So they'd been, so far as we know, they'd been copied, but they hadn't been circulated. So Beatrice was presumably not aware of it.
Okay. And does the way, by comparing those transcripts to Beatrice's version, do we get a sense of what Beatrice's policy was to what was in and what was out?
Yeah, one good example is for the entry for the 5th of April 1838, so just a couple of months before the coronation. And in Lord Esher's transcript of the journal, we see that the Queen has had a conversation with Lord Melbourne, and she spoke of the coronation, and that the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, her aunt and uncle, were very angry at the notice being given to them about the coronation, which is not really surprising, given it's still 2 months away and they've just been given the date. But nevertheless, we get a flavour of the tensions within the royal family. They're not the old members of the royal family are not happy with. Whether they're not happy with Victoria, whether they're not happy with the cabinet, it's not entirely clear, but they're certainly not happy. They feel that they're being overlooked. Then their precedence is not being kept. They're not being kept well informed, and they're not able to make the preparations that they need to make. So we do get a flavour of that. But no mention of this in Beatrice's version.
So that's interesting because I think if Beatrice's remit was anything that might cause offence to people, then it seems that that's what she's followed. It's just her mother talking about personal arguments or something like that with probably people that the Queen wouldn't have wanted to be seen to be arguing with. Obviously, Beatrice does preserve her more negative views about others. I mean, obviously, Beatrice, for people like you and me, it's frustrating that Beatrice was as thorough as she was, because the preservation of history is something that both you and I have devoted so much of our lives to exploring or finding or benefiting from, I should say, and believing that that's important. But what about other members of the royal family? I mean, you've got by the time Beatrice was really finishing off the work, you've got George V, her nephew, on the throne, married to Queen Mary. Queen Mary certainly had a sense of history. Certainly, weirdly, because although she was born into the British, although she married into the British monarchy, she was also born into it. So a real strong sense of the institution, and that's thought to be where Elizabeth II, in some ways, got her sense of it from. And how did they feel about Beatrice's redacting passion?
Well, it's said that the King and Queen, so George V and Queen Mary, weren't entirely happy with it, but they felt powerless to be able to prevent it because that had been Victoria's wish, and Beatrice was carrying out her mother's wishes. Interestingly, though, just on that point about the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, you're right. Although Queen Mary married into the British royal family, she was actually a descendant of George III herself, because the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge were her grandparents. So her mother, Princess Mary Adelaide, was Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge. So although Queen Mary did have a very strong sense of history, and certainly, it's very well known about her love of antiques and acquiring things, but she certainly did. And all the stories about her going to aristocratic houses and saying and admiring a piece of furniture, and if they didn't take the hint, then she would go back and say, I must just go and say goodbye to that delightful cabinet before I go, as a sort of all-out hint that it should be presented to her. She was also well known for buying artifacts which had belonged to members of the royal family. So, for example, for the current king's baptism, because remember, Queen Mary was still alive then, that was 5 years before she died, when the current king was born, and she gave him a silver cup which had belonged to, which George III had given to a godchild. So she said that she gave a present from her great-grandfather to her great-grandson. And so she was very in tune with preserving that history, although one wonders whether she would have been quite so interested in preserving that sort of negative sentiment that showed her grandparents in a
yes,
not even really a negative light, but that they were complaining about.
Do you think that's why Beatrice does edit this particular bit? Because obviously the Duke and Duchess themselves are long gone, but do you think that's why she's a bit like, yeah?
I think it may have contributed that she didn't want to upset the King and Queen, because Beatrice does have a reputation for even after her mother has died, of being in awe of the throne.
Yes,
but I also think that essentially, I think it's more to do with the fact she doesn't want to show her mother in a bad light. I don't think that she wants to show her mother as being gossiping about other members of the royal family to Lord Melbourne or to whoever else. I think it is more essentially about preserving Victoria's propriety rather than worrying about how Queen Mary might feel about her seeing her grandparents. Although I think it may have been in her mind. I think that if she'd been in two minds about including it, then she probably would have thought, and I don't want to offend the Queen. But I do think it is more about her mother, and that essentially has been her maxim throughout, that things are either excluded because they're too tedious, or because it shows not necessarily Victoria in a bad light, but shows other people in a bad light, other members of the royal family in a bad light, and doesn't want that to reflect badly on Victoria for having been made that.
I must say I understand that, because obviously for us as historians, royal historians, the history is everything, but these are people's family. And if I were, not that with the greatest respect to my beloved mother, I can't imagine her diaries, and as far as I know, she never kept one in her life, but I can't imagine they'd be of huge amount of interest to the public. But if I was tasked with editing her diaries, I would want some stuff just to be for her, and also some stuff that to us does not appear sensitive, like having a bit of a grumble about your aunt and uncle with a friend, when it's not particularly, not really dissing them even, is she? In a different time, taking a family matter and discussing it outside the family, or being royalty and discussing it with a non-royal, even the prime minister and even a viscount, that's a much bigger thing culturally to generations gone by than it would be to us. So you can see why that's sensitive enough for Princess Beatrice to remove. I also think I get the conspiracy theories around there must be some great dark secret that that Beatrice is hiding, but all I would say is, despite all the pages and pages and pages that Beatrice removes, if her priority was to not make her mother look bad because her mother was being unkindly rude about people, knowing Victoria as we do, I could see that taking up a lot of paper.
Yes. But yes, and I mean, Victoria's instructions have been to modify passages which were not fit for preservation. So, what does that mean?
That sounds very sinister, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. It does. I mean, the Royal Archives themselves describe, because they've all been digitised and they're available, and I would encourage anybody who's interested to go and look at the journals themselves. They describe it as anything that was too slight to be of interest, so therefore omitting a whole day, as well as passages that might offend other family members. And so that's one thing. But I think as well that it's more to do with the fact that it is fair to say that Victoria is still critical of other people. Beatrice doesn't necessarily show her mother always in a favourable light. And although, yes, we can, I mean, if you take only less than a year after the coronation, there's the Flora Hastings affair.
Of course.
And
explain, some people might not know what that is. Explain what that is.
Lady Flora Hastings was a lady in waiting to the Duchess of Kent. And there was certainly no, and she had been an active participant in the Kensington system when Victoria was a child and was very tightly controlled by her mother.
So Victoria's not going to be sympathetic to her.
No, Victoria's not sympathetic to her, and there's also a political dimension as well, because by this time Lord Melbourne's still Prime Minister, but his majority is not. His majority is waning, and Lady Flora belongs to a very prominent Tory family.
And Melbourne's a Whig, of course.
And Melbourne's a Whig, and so therefore there's the political dimension, and it happens at the same time it unfurls at the same time as the bedchamber incident. So then Robert Peel becomes Prime Minister, and he instructs Victoria that she has to remove the ladies of her household who are married to prominent Tories. Victoria refuses to do this, and so the two sort of feed on each other. So what happens with Lady Flora Hastings is that she goes to, her family live in Scotland, and she goes up to spend Christmas and New Year with them in Christmas 1838. Early 1839, she shares a carriage back with Sir John Conroy, who was the Duchess of Kent's comptroller, and again, it's very difficult. We don't want to go too much into using the language of today to describe that relationship. I know we discussed this when we were talking about Catherine of Aragon and Fray Diego, but there does seem to be a controlling aspect to this. He has control of her finances. And she is the Duchess of Kent. While we don't want to describe her as a stupid or naive woman, she does allow a certain level of control. She gives him a level of control, but also
she's a vulnerable woman, isn't she?
Vulnerable. Well, I mean, she lost her husband
with a young child.
When Victoria was less than Princess Victoria was less than a year old. Her father dies, and also she doesn't have her other children with her either, because Prince Charles has gone back to Germany, where he's prince, and Princess Theodore marries as well, not stupidly early, but she again has left. So by this time, and the Duchess of Kent has very little to do with the other members of the royal family.
Doesn't trust them,
and so therefore she feels that Conroy is the only person the only other adult that she can trust, and so he does have a degree of control over her, which I think one considered to be unhealthy, and of course he had at one point attempted to get Victoria to sign papers to give him control over her finances, to give him positions at court when she becomes queen, and to sign a paper that names the Duchess of Kent regent, even in the event of Victoria being 18, because she is too naive to rule under her in her own name, under her own right.
And most of that's cut out of Beatrice's version, interestingly.
It is,
but it does survive.
Yes, and a lot of that I think is again, and that's questionable why it's been left out, really, because that wouldn't show Queen Victoria in a bad light, but it's probably because it doesn't show the Duchess of Kent in a good light.
Yes, and it's airing a very internal family matter publicly. I think that's part of it.
And I think and I've got something, and as you've said, while that is frustrating because we want to know what happened, at the same time, I think that if that had been my family, I wouldn't necessarily want other people to. I've lost both my parents now, and there are certain things that, my parents were both good people, looked after me and everything, but there are certain things, certain arguments you may have had, certain things that they may have said or done that you wouldn't like them to talk about because it would be disloyal. And so we can understand why that happens. So anyway, back to Lady Flora Hastings. So she has come back from Scotland in the same carriage as Sir John Conroy. And a few weeks or possibly just a couple of months later, her abdomen appears to be quite swollen. And Victoria phrases this in her journal in a very delicate way, that it is brought to her attention by another person. Now, this is, we think is Baroness Lateston, her former governess. Yes. Who is now in control of the royal household, who has brought this to Victoria's attention. And the belief is that she is, they wouldn't use such a vulgar word as pregnant in those days, that she's with child. And Victoria says that she wouldn't say who she believes is responsible, but the initials of the person will be at the top of the page. And of course, they are JC. So we can imagine who that is, John Conroy.
Right.
And so that leads to a great scandal throughout the court, and Lady Flora has to then undergo a medical examination, which is inconclusive, because they say that although she appears to still be Virgo intacta, they can't rule out the fact that she may be expecting a child. Right. So it's that seems a sort of catch-all, belt and braces approach of we think that this is the case, but however we may be wrong.
Yeah.
But of course, it turns out tragically that she's not with child, and she's in fact suffering from cancer. Now, it's very often said to be liver cancer, but we're not certain whether that is actually the primary site or whether that's secondaries that have spread to her liver. But anyway, she dies then in 1839, in summer 1839, and Victoria goes to see her just before she dies to make sure that she has everything that she wants and is comfortable. And we can't imagine that was a very comfortable encounter for either of them. But that there are mentions of that in the diary, in the journals. It's questionable. We don't know the extent to which they've been excised, but there are mentions of it, and so therefore I think it is fair to say that Beatrice doesn't always paint her mother in the best light. Certain things have been preserved, although perhaps not in the same level of detail that they might have been.
Yes, and maybe Beatrice did have some sense of history and think, well, even if her mother isn't sparkling in this, and I don't think Beatrice was naive as to who her mother was.
No.
So I think she probably recognised some of that had to be preserved, but where it was an internal matter rather than an issue of historical significance, perhaps she sharpened her pencil a little bit too much with her corrections. So looking at then what we learn about Victoria's own coronation, Beatrice leaves in a fair bit of Victoria's criticisms about her own big day, doesn't she?
She does. The one that I find quite amusing is that at the ceremony, it's the right of the Bishop of Durham to accompany the monarch, and as we said, Victoria only went to the abbey the day before, and she's certainly not very complimentary about him, because he's at her side during the ceremony, and during the journal entry, she describes to Lord Melbourne that that he's remarkably maladroit because he could never tell her what was due to take place when it should have been.
What does maladroit mean?
It means, it's funny you said, because I did an interview on the radio a couple of weeks ago about the preparations for this coronation, I used that as an example actually, and nobody said anything at the time. The presenter never said anything at the time, and then after I'd finished, they went to the travel, and the travel presenter said, "What does that word mean that he used?" So it means quite naive and not really knowing what's happening.
Oh, okay, right. Which sounds like that word applied to pretty much everyone involved in the coronation.
It does. Although Victoria, as I say, I think that he comes out for particular criticism because Victoria has very little idea of what's happening, and I think she expects that somebody will tell her. So she turns to the Bishop of Durham and says, "What is to happen next, my Lord Bishop?" And he can't tell her, he shows her a point in the order of service, and they're not there yet, and so that's why she's not happy with she expects high standards. She's not putting the preparation herself, but she expects much higher standards from the other officials that are there. And I suppose is entirely unfair, given that it was their role to organise the coronation. But I still think it is a little bit rich from somebody who has put in very little effort herself.
Well, this is it, because you wouldn't really expect the bishop to be the master of ceremonies, would you? When you consider the offices of chamberlain and other things that would be involved in that kind of day. Not that she's probably very familiar with how it works, but I mean, she shouldn't she? She should have gone into it knowing what she was going to be doing.
You would have thought so. Even though she hadn't gone to the last coronation, we have to remember, and that was, we've just been talking about the Duchess of Kent and her relationship with other members of the royal family. She doesn't trust them, and so that means that she doesn't go to William IV and Queen Adelaide's coronation. But she does mention in her journal that her sister, Princess Theodora, did attend the coronation of George IV, although Victoria was only 2 years old at the time, so she would have been too young. So yeah, she was kept away from William IV's coronation. Although we were just talking about Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, their eldest daughter, Princess Augusta, who was Queen Mary's Aunt Augusta, who we might remember, the pearl and diamond tiara that the Princess of Wales is now wearing was worn by Diana, Princess of Wales.
Right.
That's, people often refer to that as the Cambridge Lovers Knot tiara. It's not. It's Queen Mary. It's a copy that Queen Mary made of the Cambridge Lovers Knot tiara, and that belonged to Aunt Augusta, who was Augusta of Cambridge, became Grand Duchess of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, and so. But she went to. She's a few years younger than Victoria, not much younger than Victoria, but a few years younger than Victoria. But she went to William IV's coronation, so one can imagine that was
okay. So it's not just that Victoria's too young.
No, it's not just that she's too young, because, as we say, Augusta is a bit younger. And also, while just on a point about the Victoria's journals and things that are said about members of the royal family, although yes, Beatrice has edited the journals very tightly where it comes to members of the royal family, we do actually have preserved in other sources some of her thoughts. So the correspondence between Victoria and the Princess Royal has been maintained and has been edited and published over several years. Well, in that, one person that comes in for particular criticism is Augusta of Cambridge, became Grand Duchess of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. She's someone who is seen as quite flighty and gossipy in the letters that Victoria sends to the Princess Royal, Crown Princess of Germany, as she is at this point. So, although if you take the journals in isolation, yes, you may not get the full rounded picture of Victoria and her character. When you take that into account, and remember that the Princess Royal married in 1858, and they kept their correspondence right up until both of them died in 1901.
And it was pretty much every day, wasn't it?
It was. Well, not quite. Yes. Well, again, almost every day. But Victoria was actually very strict with Vicky about how, she would write, you should write 2 or 3 times a week and send this by special messenger. And, all of this would be. But then it would be, she would send extra letters and she would expect a reply. And she would begin a letter with, "I still have not had a reply to my last letter of this date." And so one can imagine that she was a very demanding mother when it came to to the devotion of her children. And of course, we talk about Beatrice, especially because Beatrice was the one that stayed at home. And it was not uncommon in Victorian times to have one unmarried daughter to stay at home, become the maiden aunt. But of course, Beatrice does eventually marry, and Victoria's not happy about this. Although when they do then marry, she loves Henry of Battenberg like a son, and their children are brought up at court, and so it's not an unhappy marriage once it happens. But Victoria hates the idea of pure Beatrice being taken by.
I think they marry on condition that they stay.
Yes.
Beatrice stays with her mother, essentially, doesn't she?
Yes. But she seems no less demanding with her other children, with her older children. And certainly
Vicky doesn't even escape going all the way to Germany.
No, Vicky goes to Germany when she's only 17 as well.
Yeah.
And she's the only one of them to marry during Albert's lifetime, and she's really the only one that makes a grand match. Because she marries the Crown Prince of Germany, or Crown Prince of Prussia, is at this point, because well, he's not actually Crown Prince. His father is Crown Prince at this point, because William IV is Friedrich William IV is childless, and so his father is the heir, and so he's the next heir. But he does become Crown Prince within 3 years of their marriage. And so, but that's the only sort of. So people talk about arranged marriages of Victoria's children. Whatever. I'm a bit less. I'm a bit more relaxed about that, really, because I think that's the only one. Even though that was arranged, it was still a real love match between Vicky and Fritz. But the others, they did have actually a wider degree of choice about their spouses than you might imagine. They weren't forced, you must marry this person, and they weren't actually grand alliances, most of them, because they were
most of them not. No. Only really the two oldest girls fitted that sort of foreign princess marry into a grand family and all that stuff. I mean,
even Louis of Hesse. I mean, while it is a grand family, it's not the same, to the same degree of Vicky's marriage to Crown Prince to Fritz, who's, because Prussia is obviously the greatest power in Germany, and when German unification comes, obviously he's then tragically doesn't stay king or emperor for very long, but even so, it's thought that would be a grand match. He would be a great leader in the world stage. When Alice marries Louis of Hesse, that's he is. He has a duchy, but it's not on the same scale. And of course, the others. I mean, Helena marries Christian of Schleswig-Holstein. He's a prince without any land.
Yes, yeah.
That's why they live. That's why they make their home at Windsor, which is convenient for Victoria's by this time. And of course, Louise marries the Marquis of Lorne, later Duke of Argyll. So she's the only one to marry a British subject.
Yes.
So they're not actually that grand alliances.
I think for Victoria, the priority was more which husbands keep the daughters close.
Yes.
Victoria, I think in that sense, was that sort of mother. She was loving, but she was, I'm going to love them and keep them close so they can do what they need to do for me. Yes. So yeah, absolutely. With the exception of the first two.
And as the correspondence with Vicky shows, even though Vicky's well in Germany, she's still under her mother's not control is not the right word, but under her mother's influence, certainly, and doesn't want to do anything which will upset or offend her mother. There's this very sort of relationship of wanting her mother's approval. But not being afraid to do things that her mother won't like, but being very apologetic when she does, I think is how I would sum all of that up. So anyway, we'll just go back to the coronation, I suppose. We've talked about the Bishop of Durham being remarkably maladroit, but he's not the only member of the clergy who comes in for criticism.
Yes, because I was going to say, if the Bishop of Durham is catastrophe number one, what's catastrophe number two?
Well, the Archbishop of Canterbury is the one who, the Archbishop ought to have delivered the orb to me, but I'd already got it. And he, as usual, was so confused and puzzled, knew nothing and went away, she writes.
So what would that have looked like? Him just sort of walking up to going, where's the orb? Oh, where's the orb? Oh, you've got it. I mean, how does that even
We don't
work?
know exactly how that happened. So it could have been like that, or it could have been that he read out the words, Madam, I present the orb unto you, or words to that effect. I don't actually have a copy of the words in front of me. But then realizing that it wasn't there, it was already in her hand.
I mean,
so,
I I wonder whether, right, this is speculation now rather than some new theory that we should publish, but how much is Victoria letting herself off the hook? Has she somehow picked up the orb when she wasn't meant to have it?
Well, that's what
And
we're not
therefore,
sure of. We don't know whether she's taken it or whether she's been given it. But she only writes that she already has it. She doesn't
I
say.
think she took it. I think she just
But
went
having
up,
said that,
took the
I
orb.
would have thought no, but because they're brought in procession, I don't know whether she's just taken it early
I
or
think
whether
so.
because really it should have been presented to her. So I'm not so sure that how likely that would have been because if she's seated in the throne, it wouldn't have been easy for her to go and reach around and get it. I would have thought, but again, that's only my speculation.
No,
I
you're
don't
right. I
have any.
mean, you're right. I mean, could be unless I'm trying to, and in a sense, we might know a little bit more as we see how things play out at Charles's coronation. But whether it's something like the orb is presented to the throne, then the bishop's meant to come up, take it, bow, and hand it to her. So he sort of takes it off the throne, off the cushion or whatever it's on. I assume it's on a cushion, is it? Probably. But she just grabs, I don't know. I just wonder whether Victoria's excusing herself a little bit here.
Well, I think it's fair to say that we don't know, although it wouldn't be surprising if she had.
I agree. And it also wouldn't be surprising if she either didn't notice she'd made a mistake or she decided not to reiterate the fact she'd made the mistake.
Yeah. Because, yes, and not that she's exactly putting the blame on somebody else, because she doesn't say that he'd given it to her at the wrong time. Just that he attempted to give it to her, but she already had it. So yeah, we might be playing around with the semantics, but I think you've got a fair point there.
Definitely, and it goes back to the thing you were saying earlier about there is some validity in her saying these guys really should have known what they were doing, and it's not really on me. But the problem is you're the queen, you're the most powerful person in the room. So if you make a mistake, people just have to work around you. There's not a lot they can do if you go somewhere at the wrong time or take something at the wrong time. So actually, yes, it is. And this is what immaturity doesn't know, but age brings with you, which is that if you're a leader and you've got that power, you've got to take your responsibility more seriously, not less seriously.
I suppose it's again a really tantalizing question. Does Victoria ever really grow in that type of maturity? I'm not entirely sure that she does. She must do to a degree, but I think that there's always, even in her older age, there is that sort of slight degree of naivety that she can turn up and things will happen and whatever. I might be being unfair and that I've not got examples to cite to be able to.
No, but she supposedly famously said, "What matters is not what people think of me, but what I think of them." Probably true, but there's a sense to which, and I sometimes think with Victoria, her natural authority perhaps comes from quite an ignorant naivety, and it kind of works for her.
Yes,
because in many ways she's remembered as a greater queen than she deserves to be given credit for being. Perhaps.
Yes. Well, no, I think that's entirely fair because when I was at school and you learned about Queen Victoria and the Industrial Revolution and the growth of the empire and all of that, and so it's all seen as happening under Victoria's aegis, and yet. When you find out more about Victoria, you learn that she was actually quite a flawed individual. Not that I'm criticizing her for that. We're all flawed individuals, but the extent to which she she was very strong-willed as a young woman. Then when she married Albert, she seems to be subsumed into his German logic. And way of thinking, and she relies on him an awful lot. And then, of course, when Albert dies, she then withdraws for years. And people are talking now about is the monarchy safe under King Charles and the number of people who are protesting. Well, that's nothing to the protests that there were in the early 1800s. Of course. When she had withdrawn from public life altogether. And, the questions about the cost of the monarchy now, again, I think are nothing to the questions that were quite rightly being put on Victoria at that stage because she's refusing to appear in public. And I think people were initially very sympathetic to her when Albert dies because Albert dies at only 42. She's the same age. It seems very tragic. They've still got very young children. I mean, Beatrice is only how old is Beatrice at this point? 4 years old. So it is very sad and very tragic that Albert dies, but she withdraws for years and years. She very reluctantly opens Parliament a couple of times in the 1860s, and then even into the 1870s. She's still very, very rarely seen. She goes to St Paul's Cathedral for the Thanksgiving service when the Prince of Wales recovers from typhoid, and she makes a couple of she opens the Royal Albert Hall, for example, but still very few appearances. But then by the time of her her golden jubilee, and certainly a diamond jubilee, again this sort of myth has grown of her being a great queen. Now, that's not to say she wasn't she was neglecting her duties, because she was seeing her ministers, reading state papers, all of that. She was doing all of the desk work, but she wasn't
lazy in the way people think of her as being lazy.
No, and I think it would be
hyperactive with the letters and the diaries and the paperwork.
Indeed. But I think that she was, and who am I to criticize somebody's bereavement and somebody's depression, mental illness after that bereavement? I would feel very uncomfortable criticizing that, but I still think it is fair to say that all of that meant that Victoria was absent from public life for a very long time, and so therefore we do imagine her being a greater queen and having a greater effect than she probably did.
She was very lucky. She was very lucky with the time, and she was lucky that it really fitted Disraeli's narrative to create and unite his electoral base, to be frank, post Great Reform Acts, around a shared sense of national identity, and that national identity needing a figurehead. And Queen Victoria, when you compare Elizabeth II, Elizabeth the Great, as I will always call her, who did also achieve that kind of icon status in her own lifetime, but through, and of course, she will have enjoyed luck, good and bad, during her reign, but through sheer work and a determination to keep the crown steady on the head of
that's the big
the House
difference,
of Windsor.
isn't it? I mean, Elizabeth II was always quoted as saying, "I have to be seen to be believed." Well, Victoria didn't believe that she had to be seen to be believed. She thought that people should respect her regardless. That
which made it even the more special when she was seen.
She could withdraw to Windsor or Osborne or to Balmoral, and that people would still have as much love and respect for her whether she appeared in public or not. Whereas Elizabeth II, even in her perhaps not in the last year of her life, well, even the last year of her life, I mean, one of the things that I think we'll always remember was last summer going and staying in London for the Platinum Jubilee celebrations, and that last balcony appearance following the pageant, because we didn't expect, because I was watching it with a friend, and we weren't expecting the Queen to be there because she'd not been well enough to go to the Thanksgiving service at St Paul's Cathedral, which I think for somebody who always set great store by her faith and belief in God, that would have been a big deal for her not to go. And not to go to the Derby, because of course we all know about her interest in horse racing, and she wasn't well enough to sit through and watch the pageant. But when we saw the royal standard raised over Buckingham Palace, the excitement in the crowd, it's like a Mexican wave. It was just such a thrill.
I'm going to get emotional in a minute. I'm still not over it.
I know. And then when the barriers opened, we all ran down to get, and the sad thing was that because there was all the staging, because there'd been the concert the night before, we couldn't get an unobstructed view. I mean, I got my camera with me. I wanted to get this photograph of the Queen in the back, and of course we couldn't really get it because you've got railings in the way.
Of course,
but just having her there and singing the national anthem, and that was actually, I think, the last time we ever sang "God Save the Queen" as opposed to "God Save the King," and just seeing her there, everything just felt right. It felt that it was somehow she was there for all of us, and we were able to thank her, and she looked quite emotional when I've looked at it back. Now, is that because she knew she was ill and that it would probably be the last time she ever said, or was it simply the war, the sea of people, because there were hundreds of thousands of people there cheering for her and showing their devotion to her? It's questionable, but and so that for me, is something that was extremely special and that I think I'll always remember. I don't think, because she was somebody that I'd admired, loved, respected my whole life, that to now have that memory of being there on that day and being there for that moment, I think that that was very, very special. And so I think that, and if we believe, if we can believe what's been reported since, that she was not well, she wasn't going to be there, but it was that sense of duty that she should be there for that appearance.
Exactly.
And so that's, I think, what spurred her on, which is the opposite of Victoria. Victoria felt that people would show her their devotion, whether she turned up or not.
She did, and actually, in one sense, she had even less reason to be secure, because this was a time when monarchies were crumbling, crowns were crumbling across the world, and Victoria seems almost naively, or I don't know, stubbornly immune to that. I mean, maybe it is, as you say, she's battling with a form of depression that they wouldn't really have understood then in the same way that we would now, and she just hasn't really got the wherewithal mentally to have capacity or bandwidth to worry about that. But it ends up working for her, because that remoteness, rather than being a fat old woman sat in a palace, she becomes this mysterious, grand matriarch of an empire, and her face becomes associated with great imperial Britain, which of course she had no power over. Certainly by the second half of her reign, there's no pretense anymore, really, that monarchy is a political player. Monarchy is a political player. After the Great Reform Acts, where the franchise is so expanded, there can be no real talk of that anymore. But yet she becomes this icon, and I'm not entirely sure how much of that is to her credit, particularly, as opposed to luck. But that, anyway, we should. This is another good podcast for another time. But we should probably get back to the coronation, shouldn't we?
Yes.
So we've had 2 catastrophes so far.
Now, back to the regalia, because we've had the orb being given twice, or attempted to be given twice. The ring.
Oh,
very painful. Now, it's supposed to be the wedding ring of England. But it's the wrong size for the wedding finger.
I mean, how has that not been checked?
Well, it was made. The reason that she has a ring is because Victoria is only 19 and she's very small. I mean, she's barely 5 foot tall. So the existing rings, which would have been used for her uncles, are too big.
Yes.
So therefore, she has a new ring made for her, which is not only is the ring itself small, but the representation of the cross on is smaller as well to fit her hand better. But it's made for her little finger as opposed to her ring finger.
Right.
And there's some debate about this, whether it was actually planned for her little finger, or whether it was just because at that time there was a difference in how they would count the fingers. So whether you count the thumb or not. So therefore, you could say that.
So it's a massive miscommunication in the briefing.
Yeah, that was the fourth. The little finger was in fact the fourth finger, rather than the third finger. Rather than the fifth finger. But
how can you not check that? This is like a big day.
Well, the problem is that when the Archbishop goes to put the ring on the finger, she apparently tells him, no, it's the wrong finger.
Right.
And then he says, no, ma'am, it must go on the on the wedding finger because it's the wedding ring of England.
Kind of makes sense.
Yes. And so he puts it on there because she'd actually proffered the little finger, and he tells this, and she apparently then demurs and allows him to put it on, but she does write with great pain. But what we get in Charles Greville's diary entry, of course he's a great political diarist at the time, he writes about how she had to soak her hand in iced water for a while afterwards to be able to remove it.
Oh, that's horrible. I mean, that is horrible.
Yes.
But again, what kind of... There doesn't seem to be any ramifications in terms of people losing their job or anything, as far as we know, does there? As far as we know, no.
Could that be because Victoria does realise deep down that she hadn't prepared very well herself, and so that it would be unfair of her to, she'd not got a great handler, or even Melbourne didn't have a great. Well, we know that it's not actually down to Lord Melbourne to organise the coronation, but that's something we should make clear, that it's it is down to the Duke of Norfolk and to of the hereditary positions to arrange it.
Yeah,
so we know it's not
the Duke of Norfolk's our marshal,
yes.
presumably, isn't he?
Yes, but of course, Lord Melbourne does take a great interest in the, and of course he has the Queen's ear. He's the Queen's right hand. So therefore, any other analogies that we might care to use. So therefore, I think that he doesn't seem to have a great handle on these things either.
Does he have a role in the coronation other than being a peer that will pay homage to her?
No,
because Prime Minister's not. I believe Prime Minister's not even recognised as an official office till 1905, which is after Victoria's reign, which is when it gets added to the Order of Precedence. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure that's true.
I will. I'll quote you on that. I'll say Gareth Streeter
says 1905. The office of because I think the Prime Minister is an unofficial office.
Yes.
Until that point.
Yes. And talking of paying homage.
Yes. So we're getting on to catastrophe number 3 or 4. How many we had? 4.
Well, we've had, haven't we? We've already had. We've just talked about the ring. What do we have before that? We had.
We had the Archbishop not knowing what he was doing.
We had the orb, and then we had Bishop of Durham not knowing what was happening where.
So that's more like a warm-up catastrophe, isn't it? He's sort of setting the scene of catastrophe, and then three solid ranking catastrophes after.
Yes. So, as you've already said, at the coronation, we'd have the peers paying homage, and so they would have to climb up the steps to the Queen and kiss her hand. Now, just as an aside, there's been a real debate before the coronation about how the peers will pay homage, because traditionally they would have to kiss her cheek. Victoria doesn't want the peers kissing her cheek.
No, I don't blame her.
Well, no, nor do I, to be quite honest. But even so, it's a real break. So there's been a whole debate at this coronation about who will pay homage, whether it'll only be the Prince of Wales, whether the other, because in Queen Elizabeth II's coronation in 1953, only the royal dukes kiss her cheek. So Prince Philip does, her uncle Gloucester and her cousin the Duke of Kent do kiss her cheek and pay homage to be liege man of life and limb. The other peers do pay homage, but they don't kiss her cheek.
It wasn't for the Elizabeth II, wasn't it? Only didn't each because it just would take too long. Didn't each
representative
rank of peerage was represented by the highest peer in that degree. So the Duke of Norfolk for the dukes, I can't remember which Marquess and which Earl, but the really old titles did it, I think. Which is are they not doing that this time? They're not going to have the highest peer from each degree pay homage.
Well, they're not as far as I'm aware, because there are only 1,000 people going to attend the ceremony. We're not even going to have a sea of peers within the abbey. So apparently not. Right. It's not actually been published, or hadn't been published when we recorded this, I should say, just in case it comes out in between.
Yes, yeah.
But it hadn't been published, and so there's been a lot of speculation that only the Prince of Wales will do that, which would.
But that's to get around our Duke's dilemma, isn't it? The Sussex and York dilemma.
Oh, you had to say that, didn't you?
Ooh,
yes,
sorry.
Very probably. It would be convenient, let's say. Not only would it show a slimmed down monarchy, not only would it show a more meritocracy within the ceremony, it would also get round the difficulties of those members of the family who are now, shall we say, semi-detached, that are no longer working members of the royal family, which is why, again, we've had all this debate about who's going to be on the balcony and who isn't, who's going to the parish procession, who isn't, all of that. But whereas in Victoria's time, as was traditional, all the peers would pay homage to the Queen on coronation.
There still must have been 1,000 at that stage. Well, I'm not sure how many peers there were.
I'm not sure how many.
Hundreds.
But so, there was a lot anyway, so they would all pay homage individually. And so they do not kiss her cheek, but they do kiss her hand.
It's much better. I mean, these are old men.
One old man in particular.
Girl. Yeah.
One old man in particular, Lord Roll, 82 years old, goes to climb the steps to the throne, and then he falls over. And and literally rolls down the steps, and and I'm not laughing because he's rolled down. There is actually
I am a bit. Is that bad? I'm a little bit laughing because he.
No, that would be unfair.
Yes,
but
kind.
But some people, because his name is Roll, some of the American tourists, I'm not sure at the time or whether it's that legend, but they assume that it's an old English custom that because his name is Roll, that is his position to roll down the steps.
Oh my God. Like, is that how you English do it? Is that why Lord Roll has to roll? That was a brilliant American accent, wasn't it?
Do you know, it was as though you were in Kentucky or Chicago.
But can I just say one thing? Most of the followers of Royal History Geeks are American, and that was not intended as that was meant in good fun, because I've always loved Americans. I always and I've always appreciated the engagement of Americans in British royal history, because quite frankly, it wouldn't be doable without them. And one thing I will say, can I just say one thing? People I've often seen on royal and history Facebook groups was, oh, I bet you're American because you don't even know what you're talking about. I'm sorry, the Americans on my page are among the most knowledgeable people I have ever met. And I haven't met them, you know what I mean, about British and English royal history. So God bless America. That's what I say.
God bless America after that dodgy accent.
Yeah, sorry about the accent, but I'm working on it.
I shouldn't really say that because mine would be no better. It's just
this is an Australian accent. Is that better?
I'm just wise enough not to attempt it. I think.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, some people do think that Lord Roll has done this deliberately, but Victoria, she has a kind heart, if nothing else, because she stands up to help him to his feet, and he goes back and does it again. So we can't be too harsh on her.
No, and I'm just trying to think about the protocol of that, because I don't think Victoria was, as she gets older, certainly she loses that a little bit. Which of her prime ministers was it? She said, "Oh, you look so uncomfortable, stood up at your age, but what a shame I can't ask you to sit," or something. Was
that not Gladstone because she didn't get on with him?
I don't know that it was Gladstone, actually.
No.
Because I think she wouldn't even have expressed the sympathy with Gladstone.
Well, I'm not sure, but certainly Disraeli was allowed to sit in her presence, wasn't he?
Who was he?
I believe so. Don't quote me on that. I might be
wrong
now, but I believe Disraeli was.
The Earl of Derby.
Possibly. I was thinking
Disraeli was the Earl of Derby, wasn't he?
No, Beaconsfield.
That's it. Yes, of course.
But Lord Derby had been Prime Minister.
Yes.
In the reign. And then, of course, we had Lord Salisbury, who she was quite close to at the end of her reign. The Bob of Bob's your uncle. And
he was there for years, wasn't he?
Yes, and in different with several breaks in between.
Right. Because he was the longest serving. Like Maggie was the longest serving Prime Minister since him, I think.
But his were not all in one consecutive term.
No, but I think he did have quite a long stretch.
He did have a long stretch. But he was out of office but remained leader of the opposition, then came back, as opposed to
bit Harold Wilson.
Actually, I've said he was leader of the opposition. I'm not actually certain that he would have been at that point, but he certainly did become prime minister again. And of course, we have to remember that it becomes less and less likely, or less and less usual to have a prime minister in the Lords.
He's the last one, isn't he? In history.
As far as I'm aware, although there was in the Second World War, we nearly had Lord Halifax as opposed to Churchill, or with Lord Halifax was put forward as a credible. And who else? Well,
Anthony Eden leaves the Lords to return to go to the Commons to become Prime Minister and disclaims his earldom.
No, that was Douglas Hume.
Yes, of course it was Douglas Hume. Yeah. I mean, Anthony Eden. No, he's
given an earldom on his retirement.
Yeah, no, you're completely right. Of course, it was Earl of Hume becomes Alec Douglas Hume, and later goes back to the Lords as Lord Hume. Yes, you're completely right.
But of course, because he's already renounced his peerage, he has to be given a life period.
Yes, which is all he needs because his lad is still eligible.
Well, because even though he has renounced the peerage, doesn't mean that he's renounced it for his descendants.
No, peers that disclaim their hereditary peerage do not. Yes, you're absolutely right. They renounce it on behalf of themselves and not to their descendants.
No, and that's why if he had still been alive at the time of the Lord's Reform in 1999, he would still have been allowed to sit because his period because of his life period
There's a life
in the
period,
same
yeah,
way
yeah.
in the same way that Lord Snowden, even though that was an hereditary period, but it was considered that if your period was if that was the first creation of that period, you were the equivalent
Well,
of a
they
life
did a
peer.
sneaky thing with that. So, with this is a real tangent, but when they got rid of the hereditaries from the laws, that did technically apply to the hereditaries of the first creation, like Lord Snowden, and of course, like Charles, like Andrew, like all the royal peers. But they were all offered a life peerage as well.
And they took
So,
yes,
and all the royal dukes turned it down.
yes.
But Lord Snowden didn't, and there's
No.
like that's kind of really cheeky, Lord
Well,
Snowden,
it
because
kind
you
of
have
is,
got
but
your
then
earldom for marrying Princess Margaret, not for having done anything.
and well, it kind of is, but then I suppose one could argue that by that time, because he and Margaret, of course, had divorced, but he was not. He was no longer a member of the royal family associated with the throne.
That
So.
is true. I don't think there was a compromise in terms of his compromise constitutionally. I agree, but I just think you were given the earldom because you married into the British royal family. So why would you? And that's why you had your seat in the House of Lords, which you should probably never have taken your seat in the House of Lords. So why accept the offer of a life peerage? But anyway,
Yeah.
he had.
Well, that's a debate for another day because, of course, he didn't have the peerage when he married Margaret. That came a bit later.
Before
So
the kids. Before
yes,
the kids. Yes.
yes, so that they wouldn't
yes, he took
have.
it so they could be titled. Yeah.
Yes, so they wouldn't have children without titles. But then, of course, very interesting. Only a couple of years later, Princess Alexandra marries Angus Ogilvy, and he refuses an earldom, and her children are the first to be untitled.
The first of a princess. Yes, of course.
Yeah.
She's they're great grandchildren of a sovereign rather than grandchildren of a sovereign. And Anne is the real trailblazer, I would say, in terms of that. But yes, we have definitely gone off on a tangent, haven't we? But so Lord Melbourne, we were saying we're trying to work out how culpable he is for these catastrophes, and I think we're basically saying he's not.
Not really. He is, in as much as he has. They've made a lot of the decisions in cabinet. So cabinet decides when the date of the coronation is. Although that is a real jamboree in itself. They've had, as we said, the coronation takes place a year after Victoria's accession, and yet it's only in April that they decide when the date is, and that is at the third attempt because they originally, sorry, because in March, they decide that the original choice for the coronation is going to be either the 25th or the 26th of June. But then the following week, the Duke of Cambridge comes to see it to ask if it can be changed to the 25th, because that would be the anniversary of the Battle of Vittoria, which would be quite appropriate for Victoria's coronation. But the Queen and Lord Melbourne say it's too close to the anniversary of the accession because that would be because William IV had died the year previously on the 20th of June.
But that is actually when it happens, though.
Well, yes. Well, because the also the anniversary of George IV's death is the 26th of June. Right. So it's only on the 25th of April, 2 months later, that they do actually decide on the actual date. So it's it's gone through several stages and about a month of negotiations before they actually reach the date in which the coronation is due to take place. And so that was Melbourne and cabinet, and it was also the cabinet that had discussed whether how the peers were going to pay their homage, whether they would kiss the cheek or not. Right.
Because that's sort of a political thing, isn't it? I mean, I was thinking about this as because obviously we've talked about when we talked about Henry VIII and Henry VII's coronations, which is probably more my comfort zone. They're very important political occasions because they are symbolic of the people performing various roles will be symbolic of the power base of that reign. And therefore, the more you could associate your family with it, the better. That's less true here, of course. We're in an emerging democracy, I guess is what you'd call. Well, but it's partly because true, though, isn't it?
Yeah, it's partly because it's an emerging democracy, and partly because these positions are hereditary ones, and so because we have a very binary political system by this point between the Whigs and the Tories. If you were, and Lord Melbourne is a Whig, and Victoria, is very thinly disguised as a Whig
Yes.
sympathiser.
Melbourne's not a very good Whig, though, is he?
Well, you probably know more about that than I would, but yes, I think that's fair to say. But
Come on,
Victoria,
Peel. Sorry.
but Victoria is very much associated with Melbourne, and is very sympathetic to his views, and so therefore, if you were on the wrong side of that political divide, even if you had an hereditary office, you weren't necessarily within the inner circle. You weren't part of the charmed inner circle. You weren't necessarily included in all the. You might be at those events because you were. Because your hereditary office demanded it, but you weren't necessarily brought into the confidence of the Queen or the Prime Minister or whoever. So it's partly because of that emerging democracy, and partly because of the hereditary principle. Whereas earlier, the hereditary principle wasn't necessarily adhered to as stringently. People were attainted. People weren't necessarily able to keep their positions, and they were given elsewhere to court favourites. So, but by Victoria's reign, that's not really happening. You had people, you had peerages created, and they may well be for people who are sympathetic to the Queen or to the Prime Minister of the time, but they're not then going on to lead to be as actively involved in the ceremonial or the political aspects of the reign because of the emerging democracy, and after the Great Reform bill, there is a greater opening up of the franchise, and so the Commons has more power than the Lords by this stage. So if you are holders of the hereditary positions, you weren't necessarily going to have any real power because of it any longer.
And government by this stage is more complicated. So whereas if you're in late medieval and to a lesser extent, but still quite an extent, Tudor, it's much more about you just need powerful people who often by right of heritage and affinity and blood in a particular region of the country command the loyalty, which means you could enforce the king's law adequately there because of who you are rather than what you do. That's very important, but it's not very developed statecraft. Whereas by the time you're in Georgian Victorian England, government's a lot more tricky. You need people with good brains and with good abilities and good skills, which is going to lend itself to more of a meritocracy. I know we're not talking meritocracy proper. We're still talking meritocracy within a very small class, but you're still seeing cream rise more than, and you did start to see it much more in the Tudors, of course, and you've always seen a bit of it during history, but this is happening much, much more now by this stage in government.
Well, it's becoming the norm rather than the exception. And I think it is still relevant to say that, of course, while the franchise was increased, it is still fairly limited to how we would recognise it today. But nevertheless,
and for another 20 years it is as well.
Yes, but nevertheless, it has been opened up significantly to what it had been previously. So therefore, you are seeing less influence to around on the throne and on the political.
So what is the point of the coronation then at this point? Because it's not Elizabeth II televised and let the Commonwealth watch.
Right, no, but it is getting towards that, because you have to remember that in the 1830s, you'd had the expansion of the railways. So there were special excursion trains that were running from places like Manchester and Birmingham into London for people to be able to see the coronation procession. And so Victoria does write about the number of people that came out to see her. So that has significantly widened it than it would have been previously, because previously you would really have had to have lived in or just around London to have been able to see it if you were an ordinary person. Now, admittedly, this is just before railway mania, before the great expansion of the railways. But nevertheless, you do have the railways bringing people into London to be able to see the coronation and the procession. So, and of course, you now have you have mass media in that you have the newspapers, and you do get a sense that the public are being more included and being involved in the coronation than had been previously. So, even though, yes, it's not mass media to the degree that would have been in 1953 and certainly not today, it is going towards that. It's significantly wider in the number of people that would see, even than William IV's only 7 years.
So, in a sense, if we say coronations have always been a PR exercise in part, which is not to say they're or they were, in a sense, they've kept that same role, because the coronation of, say, Henry VII had to appeal to the political class. You could pretty much get the political class in a room.
Yes.
Not quite, but to a large extent. Victoria is still appealing to the political class, in the sense of not the political class, but people that have some increasing political involvement, which is a wider franchise. But she's even going beyond that at this stage, but she's anticipating, not consciously, of course, but she's anticipating what will happen during her reign in terms of the importance of the public as political determiners. I mean, I'm oversimplifying hugely, because, you know, who knows, a great debate as to what stage, to what stage people truly felt enfranchised even once they had the vote. But I think there's something poetically.
Well, I mean, you could, yes, but I think that as well, having previously said that Victoria expected people to like her and be respectful of her, whether she appeared in public or not. I think that's while that is true, and I stand by that. I think that she also does have a great sense that when she is cheered by people, she is humbled by it, and that you see that throughout her reign. And so I think that because she writes about it on Coronation Day, but she, much later she writes about it at the time of the Golden Jubilee, the Diamond Jubilee, about the thousands of people that turn out to see her, cheer her, sing the national anthem, all of those things. She does seem genuinely surprised and humbled that people respect her as an individual rather than just have respect for the throne. So I think that she is mindful of that, even though she doesn't appear in public for a lot of her reign, and there are reasons for it, but she is mindful that when she does, people will cheer her, will see her, and that's but it's because they have some sort of connection with her and admire and respect her, rather than just because she's the queen.
Yeah,
because she does. It is fair to say that she does get her fair share of boos and hisses at various times. We've talked about
and gunshots.
Yes, but in Royal Ascot during the time of the Flora Hastings affair, she is booed and hissed quite loudly by Whig sympathisers. By Tory sympathisers, because of the way in which she's treated Flora Hastings. And later on, when there has been the Republican movement builds momentum after Albert's death, when she does appear again, she is sometimes booed. And of course, there's those attempts on her life as well. So let's not forget that she would be aware of the sense of danger.
Yes.
But essentially, we do still get the impression that she appreciates the fact that when these things are organised, she is there, and she does receive the warmth and affection of the people. But talking of warmth and affection, it's a bit of a moot point to discuss whether members of the royal family like each other much or not on Coronation Day. And there's certainly been a lot of speculation about that at this current coronation. But while we talked a bit earlier about the relationship between Victoria and her mother.
Yes.
Now, there's nothing in the journals that says that there's any bad feeling between them. But I think we can infer that there is by what is not said. Well, if we look at it, Victoria is very, very effusive about certain other people. So take Lord Melbourne first. We all know about that
Lord M.
Dear Lord M.
Dear Lord M.
Or my good Lord M.
Did you watch the Victoria series on ITV?
Yes.
I mean, it was magical, wasn't it? And you had a very romanticized portrayal.
Well, what I would say is that they showed. Let's not get into the inaccuracies too much. But what I would, I'm terrible. I mean, if I watch anything like that with anybody, I mean, when my dad was alive, we used to watch programs like that. He used to say, "Can you not just watch it? Do you have to sit there and criticize everything?"
I know.
No, I do have to sit there and criticize everything. I'm sorry, I do. It's just within me. If I don't say it, it will annoy me too much. But I very much, firstly, they didn't actually have a coronation banquet, as was shown there. They did have receptions at the palace, though. But I mean, we don't know this, but I very much doubt. And yes, the champagne would have been flowing, but I very much doubt that she got quite drunk and made a pass at him in front of.
Well, no. This is why I love Victoria, partly because it was sort of, it came on, it started as Downton Abbey finished, didn't it? And it sort of filled that void on ITV. But for me,
I mean, I want to point out, I did enjoy watching it.
No,
sure.
I
thought it was a lovely put together series and looked very nice. But but I suppose the thing that sort of got me, and I did actually write a column about this at the time. Because we've talked about Flora Hastings and all that, it showed her, to heighten the dramatic effect. It showed her having her medical examination to prove that she wasn't pregnant. On the same day as the coronation, when actually it happened a year later. Now, I'm not just trying to be a pedant at that, but it wasn't. But because that happened at this, whereas the bedchamber crisis happened in the next episode, and Flora Hastings already shown to be dead at this time, whereas actually the one fed the other because of the political affiliation of Flora Hastings' family. The one fed the other, and so therefore, by killing her off in the previous episode, you lost a lot of the nuance that was happening there. So I'm not just saying it to be a pedant, because I do realise that you have to have some degree of dramatic license if you are putting together a television programme.
I'm having a moment of empathy with you, because this is why I love Victoria, because in recent years, there's been a lot on the Wars of the Roses and early Tudor and then Tudor general fiction. Now that's my sweet spot. I wouldn't call myself an expert on anything, but whatever expertise I have is basically in the 15th century, very early 16th. So I just can't watch it without ruining it for everyone I'm with, pointing out everything and sort of grieving that something that I think is really important is not there. But because with Victoria, yes, I know more about Victoria than I think the average person does, but I don't know as much as you, and I don't know as much as someone that's spent a lot of time.
I'm certainly not an expert on Victoria, but
you know more than I do, so I can
watch more about it.
I can watch more of it, and yes, of course, I know lots of it's inaccurate, and then I know there are bits that I don't know, but will be, but it doesn't bother me the same way because it's not been my kind of life's work. So that's what I loved about watching Victoria, is I could relax.
Yes. I must say though, I know I'll sound terribly middle-aged saying this, but I don't think we make these programs like we used to. My absolute favourite costume. I mean, I like one of the benefits of having older parents was that my dad had watched a lot of these series in the 70s. So had watched Six Wives of Henry VIII, Elizabeth R, Shadow of the Tower, all of those. And so when they were then repeated later, he used to say, oh, you ought to watch this, you'll like it. Well, one of the ones that he did introduce me to was Edward VII. Now, Edward VII, I think, is the most fantastic series.
I've never seen it.
Yeah, watch it. Honestly, I really recommend it, and it's a bit of a misnomer calling it Edward VII, because while it is his life, it begins before he's born. It begins the moment that Victoria finds out she's expecting another child.
Oh, right.
And it's, she's in the nursery with Albert looking at Vicky, or Pussy as they called her. And, and he's saying, oh, isn't she the most precious thing in the world? And she's saying, no, all babies are ugly and I'm going to have another. And that's, and so, you really get Victoria's character. And so and Victoria is played by Annette Crosby, who I think is a really underrated actress. She won a BAFTA not only for Catherine Rowgan in Six Wives of Henry VIII, but also for Victoria in Edward VII. And I think that series is probably the closest you'll get to an accurate portrayal of history of the time, while retaining the drama and retaining, and it still being entertaining. Yeah. And when you look at the people that are in it, I mean, Victoria's played by Annette Crosby, Prince Albert's played by Robert Hardy, Edward VII is played by Timothy West, Queen Alexandra by Helen Ryan, Felicity Kendall is Vicky, and John Gielgud is Disraeli, Michael Hordern is Gladstone, even great theatrical knights playing some of the small parts in it. And one for you being an EastEnders fan, there's a cameo by Lou Beale, Anna Wing, as an old woman who lives near Sandringham, who asks if Edward VII, when he's Prince of Wales, would cart her basket to market because he's going she thinks he's going towards Norwich, and he tells her no, he's going to turn off oh, and she said, oh, I've come a long way. He says, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a portrait of my mother. And then he rides off, and of course, she looks gold sovereign. So watch it just for that.
Okay, well, I will then. I will. If it's got Lou Beale in, that's you had me at EastEnders. You should have started there. But anyway,
no, seriously, it's great. But it does retain a certain level of accuracy that I think is more lacking in more recent dramas. And so that's the thing that I lament. I think that we seem to have lost the knack of retaining. And yes, when you watch it now, it does look rather it does look a bit old-fashioned. The scenes are a lot longer than you would have today, and the acting is not hammy, but certainly a bit more theatrical, because they are filmed like theatre, because they're filmed multi-camera, which favours the actor rather than being done as you would a film, and they're filmed in story order. So it is done differently to how it would be done now. And so, yes, it might look a bit old-fashioned, like Upstairs, Downstairs, compared to Downton Abbey.
Yeah.
It might be considered old-fashioned the way that it's shot and written, but it does retain. Those older dramas do tend to have a greater level of accuracy than we see in the more current ones.
Yes. I think that was more important for people then, because the truth is, people watch historical fiction, and they want to believe it at least could be true. Not necessarily that it was, but that it could have been.
I mean, if you take Victoria, for example, and because I've always liked, my dad was always interested in railways, and I sort of got that from him. And so there's that episode where she and Albert are going on, in a goods train, and it's all very exciting. It's the first time it's happened. Well, actually, it's well documented that they went in. I'm not sure actually it was the Royal Train then, but certainly a director's saloon, and they went from Paddington to Slough to go to Windsor Castle, and that was well documented. And the late Queen, she used to go between London and Windsor all the time, but went on a ceremonial, went in a public engagement to trace the same route, to mark the 150th anniversary of that. And so therefore it's people, my worry is that children will watch that and that they'll quote that as being history.
Oh, well, they do, there's no doubt about that. And you get that,
and I think that's a real sadness, and especially because you can get it right. And I'm going to go a complete tangent. I don't want to go off too far, but one thing I will say, not all not all old-fashioned dramas got it right, because if you look at Mary Queen of Scots, the film, with Vanessa Redgrave and Elizabeth and Glenda Jackson, who plays the role after. She did the same year she did Elizabeth R. The inaccuracies, of course, it shows them meeting and more than once. But right in the opening scenes, when Mary's married to Francis II, or Francois, as she calls him, they're having an idyllic time, walking along. These idyllic paths in the Loire. They're going on the river, and then suddenly he's seized by these headaches, and he's dead, and he's dying very quickly. But he dies not in bed, but he's riding off on the horse, because the pain's less when he rides, and they find his dead body. Of course, he died in bed, and he, and I just think that that's so sad, because the story is dramatic enough that he gets an ear infection when he's out hunting, and he swoons when he's in chapel and collapses, and all of that would have been dramatic enough to have made a good story without having to embellish it in the way that they had.
It would, but my logic with most of historical fiction is, yes, for every 10 people that watch, 9 will just believe that's true, or maybe a bit less, but be a bit generous. But 1 might go on and I really want to find out what happened here, and then they become a James Taylor or a Gareth Streeter, or maybe even more than that. If there can be more.
I wouldn't hold myself as any great bastion, but what I would say, because I'd always been interested, I'd always read books and whatever. So then I knew the history, may not have known it in great detail, but knew something of it before. I mean, I remember reading I was at school reading Antonia Fraser's book of Mary Queen of Scots. So I sort of knew history before I saw the film. And so then when I did see the film, when it was on television,
yeah.
Sorry.
No, I understand that. But back to Dear Lord M.
Dear Lord M. So, anyway, he's described, my excellent Lord Melbourne stood very close to me throughout the whole ceremony. I was completely overcome and was very much affected. He gave me such a kind, and may I say, fatherly look. I mean, for a girl who lost her, who never knew her father, I mean,
I know.
you've got to have some sympathy. And then when Lord Melbourne's turn to do homage came, there was some loud cheering. They also cheered Lord Grey and the Duke of Wellington. And then later she ascended, leaning on Lord Melbourne's hand. You know, there's constant references to him.
But he was a romantic. I know he wasn't what he was portrayed as being in Victoria, but if you look at portraits of him, he was a handsome man, and he was suave, and he was quite I think he would have been quite a romantic figure. Now, that's not to say that she has a explicitly sexual crush on him, but it might all be caught up with a very romantic, and a romantic with a small r experience.
I think so, but I think more than anything else, it's as kind of he's a quasi father to her, isn't he? He's an older man. He is, by virtue of being prime minister, he is in attendance on her daily,
more than he needs to be, probably
more than he needs to be. Yes. Well, he's acting in effect as a private secretary as well as prime minister, isn't he? At the beginning of her reign, and because
we should just say with that although the Queen is not powerful like Elizabeth I, nor is Victoria at her succession quite as much just a figurehead as Elizabeth II is at hers, there is still an ambiguity as to how much the Prime Minister draws his power from the Crown.
And Lord Melbourne would have known that himself, because he was dismissed from office by William IV only 3 years before Victoria came to the throne.
Exactly.
Which is the last time that happens in the UK. Of course, it did happen to Elizabeth II in Australia as the Queen of Australia,
the Governor General.
But the last time that happened, so that is in very, very recent memory at the time Victoria comes to the throne. So she would have that feeling that she could dismiss the Prime Minister if she chose to. And of course, Robert Peel doesn't take up the premiership because of the bedchamber crisis, because Victoria refuses.
And she gets away with it. I mean, that's phenomenal. I mean, we can't really go into the bedchamber crisis now, I don't think, because I think people might consider that a tangent too many, but we should come back another time to talk about it. But this is sort of what I was saying earlier about Victoria's sheer nerve, I think, comes more from a girlish ignorance, which could just easily be a boyish ignorance. I don't mean that to be a gendered point, but more a point about age. And I don't think it comes from her thinking, I'm going to use my power as queen because I understand my constitutional significance.
I think she just expects that it's there. And the more surprising thing is that nobody seems to question her.
Well, who can?
Or that we know. Well, yes, who can, because she's the queen. But it seems that the officials don't, that people go along with it rather than attempt to explain it, or through other parties, through other channels, through it doesn't seem to be, there seems to be little effort to attempt to try and correct it, even if you know that you would have very little chance of success. It seems that there's very little effort in attempting to do that.
But I guess she's not listening to her mum at this point. She's got no husband now, and of course this all changes when Albert comes along and recognizes that if she's not acting as a constitutional monarch, she puts the monarchy in jeopardy. And he's also far less keen on the Whigs, the Whigs in general, and Melbourne specifically. So Albert comes along, can be that voice. But at the moment, the people around Victoria who could be talking to her and giving her counsel are Melbourne. Melbourne is benefiting from his relationship with Victoria and the interest that she's taking. So why would he do that?
Exactly. But Melbourne's not the only person that she's effusive about in the coronation. Because if you look, there was another most dear being present at the ceremony in the box immediately above the royal box who witnessed me. It was, of course, my dearly beloved angelic Lates, and her former,
of course,
but no mention of Mama.
No, Layton is the mother figure, isn't she?
Yeah.
I mean, so is she? What would we call her? A governess?
She was her governess, wasn't she? But by this stage, she's she's running the royal household. Now, the extent to which she's actively running the royal household, or certainly doing a good job of running the royal household, is called into question. Certainly when Albert comes along, and it's very telling that Lehzen doesn't last very much longer. Although going back to Victoria, she lasted around 6 or 7 years longer than she did in reality. But
yes,
but really, she still has a great influence over. She's not a hairdresser, but she does have great influence over the.
Is she mistress of the bedchambers? Do you know? I can't remember what she actually.
I don't think that was actually her title at this point.
No, I think that probably had to go to a duchess.
I could be wrong. Yeah, well, certainly the mistress of the robes is a duchess,
right.
and that is still a political appointment at this stage. So at this point,
it's a whip, is it? Presumably.
Yeah, and it's the Duchess of Sutherland at this point.
Is it?
Yes, although it does change.
Oh, it has. So it's a political appointment, as in they're part of the government.
Well, yes, because that's part of the whole thing with the bedchamber crisis. That
so you're talking about in Victoria's time, not in.
Yes. Oh no, sorry, not now.
Yeah,
not now. No, there is no current Duchess appointed as Mistress of the Robes. I mean, the last one was the Dowager Duchess of Grafton, who died. I think a year before the Queen died in the last couple of years, but she hadn't been active at court for several years. I mean, she was over 100 when she died, and so there was there'd been a sort of the next level down, the ladies of the bedchamber, because of course there are ladies of the bedchamber and women of the bedchamber. So ladies of the bedchamber tend to be are of a higher aristocratic rank. I think it's difficult to give a precise, because they do sometimes, and also it is always a duchess. So the Dowager Duchess of Devonshire was the Mistress of the Robes at the time Elizabeth II became Queen. But she retired in 1967, and the Duchess of Grafton was still Countess of Euston when she became Mistress of the Robes.
Oh, I see. But she was a Duchess in waiting.
She was Duchess in waiting, so she was allowed to become.
Yeah. Right.
So it's no longer a political appointment, it's only an honorary one. But of course, in Victoria's time, it was still a political appointment.
Well, I think a lot of the problem with these roles, if I remember, and why Victoria felt she shouldn't have to have changed them, is it wasn't that the roles were per se political, but it was their proximity to her.
It was yes, and it was who these ladies were married to, because their husbands were members of the government, and so it was seen that they could have undue influence over Victoria through their wives.
Because I think Victoria said, well, Queen Adelaide didn't have to change hers when there was change of government, and true. Queen Charlotte didn't have to change hers, but they weren't Queen Regnant.
No, and that's the big difference, isn't it? Because the Queen Consort would have certainly had no overt political power. Although, of course, there were lots of rumours about Queen Adelaide and the influence that she had over William IV to bring forth her political leanings. But essentially, they were that's the issue with the Queen Regnant, isn't it? And that's why and that's symbolic at the coronation, because at the coronation of a Queen Regnant, it is the only time that you would have both the peers and the peeresses put on their coronets at the time of the crowning, because if there is a king and a Queen Consort, they would do it separately. The peers would put on their coronets at the time of the King's crowns, and the peeresses would do it at the Queen Consorts. So the Queen Regnant, that happens at the set, and so that's symbolic of what's happening. So she's both king and queen in effect, and so therefore those ladies of the bedchamber who are not necessarily actually political themselves, but are married to members of the government, can be seen to have influence. And so that's only dangerous because the Queen Regnant, the government is in her name, whereas when it's the Queen Consort, and it's in her husband's name, therefore there is influence, but it's another step further removed.
Exactly.
So it's less immediate, and it's less dangerous, for want of a better word.
Yes, and that makes complete sense. And Victoria, unfortunately, didn't have the wherewithal to realise that in the 1840s.
So, and I think that's her part of her naivety. The fact that she, not only is it her age, but it's also the fact that she had very little relationship with William IV when he was king.
Yes.
And so
no mentoring.
Not that he would necessarily have been a great role model as a mentor but nevertheless, there was no kind of influence from the throne. No opportunity to learn at, what's the expression, learn at Nelly's elbow. There's no opportunity for her to learn anything like that. Anything she does learn comes, and her mother isn't well versed in
No.
this. And so therefore it is really only what she learns from Melbourne at the beginning of the reign.
Yeah.
But
And Lazen doesn't know anything either. I
no,
mean,
no,
how could she?
and that's as well because she's a young woman rather than a young man. You know, it's not. It would not be seen as propriety for her to have, you know, lots of to have intimate relations sounds terrible because that makes it sound sexual. But I mean, to have intimate friendships with young men.
Yes.
You know, for her to be left alone with them, for example, whereas Melbourne, because he's so much older, that's not to say there couldn't have been any kind of. I'm not suggesting there was a sexual relationship, but not that that would have been impossible. But it's much less likely, and because of the positions of state, by this point, it's allowed. Whereas that's why, even though we can infer by the fact that although we've heard about all these references to Lord Melbourne, to Lehzen, and very little about her mother, that we can infer that the relationship between Victoria and her mother was probably at its widest gap.
Does she say anything about the Duchess of Kent?
She does. She says that that they had dinner, and that Mamma and Theodore remained to see the illuminations and only came in later. Mamma went away before I did, stayed in the drawing room until 20 minutes past 11, but remained till 12 o'clock on Mamma's balcony looking at the fireworks in Green Park, which were quite beautiful. And that really is all that is said about her mother. And that's really that she just happened to be in the room and they saw the fireworks together. There's no affection, no love there. And interestingly, that is the same in both the Isha transcripts and in Princess Beatrice's version. That's not been altered in any way by Beatrice. So I think from that we can infer that there is little love lost between them at this point. But of course, because of propriety, because Victoria is a young unmarried woman, even though she's the queen, she has to live with her mother. Her mother has to live at the palace, and so therefore, even though they're probably not really on speaking terms, other than good morning, good evening, they have to maintain this pretense that for the good of Victoria's propriety and for the good of society, that everything is all right. And from what we understand, they did both play it with a plot. They both understood that and did play the game. So there's the courtly sort of ritual that they would see each other and they would appear at court ceremonies, but very little real.
And Victoria isn't humiliating her mother by excluding her from these sorts of moments where
and she's not being, and from what we understand, she's not being overtly nasty to her mother either. She's not saying evil things either to her or about her in the presence of others. Just that it's a strange relationship. That would certainly be my reading of it. Somebody somebody who studied it in more depth than me might have a different reading, but that's certainly the way that I would understand it. That they're tolerating each other, but they're not getting on. A cold war, effectively.
Yes. I wonder whether we talk about Victoria's coronation as the ultimate coronation of catastrophes. I wonder in years to come whether she would have looked back and seen one of them. I don't know if she had the self-awareness to process it like this, but one of the catastrophes was that she didn't truly share it with her mother in terms of it the fullest sense. I'm mindful that does she not, after her mother's, you'll know this more than I will, but after her mother's death, I think she decries how those awful people, meaning Conroy and actually Lehzen, kept her and her mother apart for so long. So she's abdicating a responsibility of herself, but she's also absolving her mother, and she's blaming these other two characters for it.
Well, it's not just those two, but yes, it would be other people like Flora Hastings and others at the time. Yeah, so that's that's true. I mean, we don't know what she felt about Coronation Day and her mother, but she certainly does lament the fact that they weren't closer when they were younger. And she certainly does, she refers to her mother only in the most glowing terms after her death. I mean, she does say that, I think she does. I'd have to look at it in more detail, but I think she does acknowledge that there had been issues between them, and that they were both culpable in some way. But essentially, she's looking back through rose-tinted spectacles, and she's also not acknowledging really that a lot of it was down to the agency of both those women, rather than the fact that other people were getting involved. So I would wager that she probably did look back and regret that she didn't share that. And I mean, this may be a fanciful step too far, but I think that if she had read back those entries, which we know she sometimes did, about not so much about Melbourne, because I don't think Melbourne was taking the fatherly role, but certainly the way she refers to Leighton as being the most angelic person, the person closest to me, and all of that. Would she have read that and had those pangs of guilt about, I wish I'd been saying that about my mama? I don't know that she did, but I would wager that it's likely that she would have done, given what we know about Victoria and given what we know about
her for not editing it back. You read sometimes political memoirs based on diaries, and it's like, oh, I have this terrible worry that I think someone might invade the Falklands in a few years' time, or whatever. Do you know what I mean? And all these that either they're so wise after the event, before the event, but she could have, because she obviously feels very hostile in her memory to Leighton later, which I think is quite sad. But she doesn't censor her early affections.
No.
And I admire that.
No, and I don't think those early affections are ever entirely gone, but she does realise that Leighton was not entirely a benevolent figure.
Yes. And I guess that is part of growing up. We look
it is. I think for all of us, when you're a small child, you see your parents as being heroic. And then it's as you get older, you realise that they have the same stresses, strains that anybody else does, and they become slightly less heroic. That doesn't mean to say that they're any less, that you hold them in any less regard.
Yeah,
you don't see them as being kind of superheroes in the same way that you do when you're a small child. And I think that is to do with maturity. But
likewise, in your adolescence, you sometimes really resent your parents and the structures and regulations they've put around your life. And in a sense, Victoria's in a late adolescence at this stage because of the weirdness of her upbringing. And then as you get older, into your 20s, 30s, 40s, you look back and you're so grateful for your parents and appreciative of those things you did that you hated them for in your rebellious patch. And I guess Victoria's going through that to an extent here.
And of course, because she's become queen, she's not had a sort of gradual loosening of the apron strings. She goes from being completely under her mother's influence, begrudgingly on Victoria's part, but completely under her mother's influence to, the first thing that she does when she becomes queen is that she orders that her bed is taken to the next room because she's been sleeping in the same bedroom as her mother, and that she goes down the stairs alone to meet Lord Melbourne alone. It's all of those things are the first things that she thinks of doing that. So it's a complete and utter change, and so quickly. Whereas for most people, it will be more gradual. And so therefore that I think that also helps that feeling as well, because with it's accelerated at 1,000 miles an hour. She goes from being completely the child to being the queen overnight. And that's the hereditary system for you. That does happen, but it's just she doesn't have that opportunity to process it, or to be able to, or for that relationship to evolve. It just changes completely. And that's not to remove the influence of people like Conroy from it, because obviously that will have affected things. But I think that even without Conroy and without the strictures that imposed by the Duchess of Kent, I think that the process that Victoria went through would probably have been the same without those extreme figures involved.
I agree. And I suppose summing up this episode then, I guess we can see that this chaotic coronation comes to Victoria at a chaotic time in her life. When we were talking about Catherine of Aragon, we thought, well, she had a day of great joy, but we know there's tragedy coming. I guess what I quite like about Victoria's is there's chaos in her on the day and in her life, but there's some real love and peace coming. Now there's tragedy too, of course.
Yes.
But to quote Her late Majesty Elizabeth the Great, grief is the price we pay for love, and that's the great grief that Victoria later has, is because of the great love she finds for Albert and her mother.
Yes.
And it's nice to know that this chaos we find Victoria in today is not the end of the story.
Indeed, it's not. And I think I've quoted the Edward VII, the TV series. There's a great scene where Gladstone is at the time of the Diamond Jubilee, calling her I can't remember the exact words, but something like, stubborn old woman. And the Prince of Wales says, yes, indeed, stubborn old woman. Stubborn and obstinate old woman, I think she is, and a great queen. And I think that's really how Victoria keeps the show, even though she retreats for a long time, she keeps the show on the road, and she never stops, she never loses the sense that she is the queen. And I think that remains with her. That's there. We can certainly see it here at the coronation. That remains with her right through until the end of her reign.
Well, this brings us to the end of our series on coronation catastrophes. James, thank you for your work and insights and for discussions. I hope everyone's enjoyed it. I know we've been long, but I hope it's been good fun to listen to while the ironing's on, while you're doing the ironing or dinner's on.
I always listen when I'm not running to podcasts.
Well, people might. We speak at pace, so I think that would be attractive. There are no plans for another episode in this series, guys, or indeed no firm plans for any other podcast series. But if you've enjoyed this, let us know, because there could be more where this came from on this topic, probably not with this exact topic or other topics. We'd love to know your feedback. We'd love to know your thoughts. The royal history geeks out there make so much of what we do possible, and we're so grateful. Thank you for listening, everyone, and we hope to speak to you again in some format very soon.
Bye.